Hi, everyone, and welcome to Careers and Conservation with the Nature Conservancy, produced by the UF Thompson Earth Systems Institute's Scientist in Every Florida School program. Scientist in Every Florida School is a free program housed within the Thompson Earth Systems Institute at the University of Florida. The CEFS program connects and builds long-term partnerships between teachers and scientists in order to bring current scientific research and big data into classrooms in Florida and beyond. The Nature Conservancy is considered one of the largest private nonprofit environmental organizations in the world. Its mission is to conserve the lands and waters on which all life depends. The Conservancy works in all 50 states as well as 79 countries and has over 3,500 dedicated people who work to accomplish this mission. In Florida, the Conservancy uses science to decide where to protect habitat that's being threatened by construction projects, how to improve broken ecosystems that are homes to rare plants and animals, and why people and nature are so closely connected. But the Conservancy can't do the world's environmental problems all alone, so they partner with state and federal governments, with other nonprofit environmental organizations, and with thousands of volunteers and members. Today, we're joined by Brian, Beatrice, and Caitlin from the Nature Conservancy. These environmental experts will explain to you their individual roles within the Nature Conservancy. As they tell you about their work, please direct your questions to the intended speaker in the chat box, and our moderator will be sure to answer them with the scientists for you. Why don't we get started? Brian, I'm going to send things off to you. Please take it away. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Stephanie and Brian, and thank you everybody for showing up today. We wanted to talk a little bit about our journeys, how we became Nature Conservancy biologists. Science careers are a little bit like a science experiment in and of themselves, and we start good science experiments with a hypothesis. So here's a hypothesis I'll kick off for all of you. I would be happier if blank, or I would get closer to answering my big question if blank. And then every class, every job, every city you relocate to, every team that you work on are like variables in that experiment. So for instance, if we have a friend, we'll call her Rose, took a biology class in high school and liked it, and now she's heading to college or a new job doing something that builds on what she knows. We try to make each step build off of the previous one, and as you get closer and closer in your career, you'll find that your jobs make you satisfied, you're getting closer and closer to the answer that you wanted to question. So we try not to worry too much about how long it takes. You can see in this map, we have 3 different biologists on the screen. I'm the little red fire truck, Caitlin's the little green boat, and Beatrice is the little purple plane. We all took very different routes to get to where we are now. Some of those routes took a long time. Sometimes they involve school or jobs or internships, but ultimately we all landed where we are. And the important things to remember, not so much about how much money you're going to make or how long it's going to take, but think about how you want to answer those questions. Work really hard, and the options will open up for you, and just stay dedicated to your cause. That's really important. So next slide. My job is restoration project manager for our North Florida program, and that requires a mix of some science, biology and ecology mostly, but also some finance and management, which is like writing and math. It helps to have a good personality and some technical skills on equipment, fire operations, data collection. And some of those skills I learned after I got here to North Florida, and some of them I brought with me. One of the first things that I learned is that longleaf pine forests used to cover 90 million acres from Virginia all the way to Texas. And by the 1970s, there was only about 5 million left. So that means 95% of the longleaf pine in North America was converted into something else. And I also learned that longleaf pines are one of the most diverse ecosystems, which means that there's lots of plants and animals that call that home. In fact, right around here, around Tallahassee, Florida, we're in one of the top 5 diversity hotspots of all of North America. So it's sort of like an African savanna or an Amazon rainforest. But instead of needing lots of rain, the animals and plants that live in longleaf forests actually need fire to help clean up the forest floor and make room for just the right combination of plants and animals that can call it home. And all of those animals and plants are specialized to live in that kind of fire forest environment where they've adapted to either go underground or regrow and respond to that fire in a healthy way. So fire helps filter out the plants that don't have those adaptations. And when we use fire to help manage the forest, we get the species that we're really interested in. In many cases, those are threatened and endangered plants and animals. The Nature Conservancy decided over 30 years ago to try and save as much of that longleaf pine forest as they possibly could, and also try and restore the forests that were all messed up by other kinds of land uses. So here's a quick 4-step recipe for how to take a busted up longleaf pine forest and bring it back to something that plants and animals would want to live in. So step 1, we have to fix the soil. And in this picture, you can see what looks like maybe a white piece of paper with lines drawn on it. That's actually an aerial photograph from the 1950s of a sandhill site that we did restoration on. And those little lines were very precise bulldozer lines that scraped up all of the topsoil, all of the seeds, and all of the plants that were in the ground, because the people that owned this particular piece of property before we restored it wanted to plant pine trees on it that they didn't want to have any competition for. So they scraped up all the competition and they pushed it into these very, very perfect, precise lines. Well, when we started our restoration project, we needed to smooth those lines back out and fix some of that soil disturbance that was done. So once that was completed, you can see step 2 was adding the right ingredients. These are seeds from ground cover species, which are grasses and flowers that a lot of the plants, that a lot of the animals that call sandhill longleaf pine systems home need in order for them to eat and make nests and things like that. So adding the right plant species. And then of course we planted trees once we put those seeds down. And then we wait about 40 months until we're ready for our first burn. And during that 40 months, those plants are starting to grow up and set seeds and maybe even reproduce a little bit. And by that 40-month period, so that's 3.5 years after the picture that's got the tractors in it, we're able to actually set that forest on fire and let that process begin to do the important work that it's doing. And then the 4th step is a really critical one. This is a big science step, which is that when we ask a question and then we try and answer that question by doing things, treatments on the ground, we have to go back and measure whether we were successful or not. So in this case, we might be measuring the number of toads in a wetland, or we might be measuring the diversity of plants on the ground. But having an idea of what we want to measure and how to measure them is really essential in being able to answer the question that we originally set out to. Okay, next slide. So it takes a lot of time and it takes a lot of money to bring these busted up longleaf pine forests back to the point that rare plants and animals would even want to call them home. So why should we do it? Well, there's 2 reasons. First of all, because people need forests. And secondly, because forests need people. Why do people need forests? Well, almost all of our fresh water and clean air at one point comes through a forest, and it gets filtered through either through the leaves of the trees that help produce oxygen, or down in the roots that help filter fresh water. That here in Florida, we're lucky enough to have this giant underground lake called the Floridan Aquifer. And all the water that goes down into that aquifer comes down through the soil at some point. And the cleaner and the healthier our forests are, the better job they can do at filtering that water. Also, we need wood products like paper and construction lumber to be able to build houses and take tests at school. And then finally, really important is that it's important for us to be able to study, to do science out in these complex places. And forests are really an exciting and enriching place to do good science. Forests, of course, need people to help protect them, because if we don't understand them, we won't go out of our way to make sure that they continue to be healthy and managed and don't get turned into all kinds of other things, parking lots and highways and things like that. So I'm going to go ahead and pass it off to Bee now, and she's going to talk about red-cockaded woodpeckers.
Well, hello, everyone. I am Bee. I'm a biologist also with the Nature Conservancy. And one of the things biologists do is work with rare plants and animals on nature preserves. When I was a little girl, I was really sad to learn that animals were disappearing around the world because they were losing their natural areas where they lived. So I decided to become a biologist to help save natural areas for wildlife habitat. So I went to the University of Florida and got a degree in biology, and I wanted to work as a conservation biologist, and I was lucky to get to work with the Nature Conservancy, where my role as a biologist has been to save rare species. And so I'm going to tell you about one animal that I work with, the red-cockaded woodpecker. This is just one example of how biologists work together to save a rare species from disappearing from the earth. We call red-cockaded woodpeckers RCWs for short. Now, this bird was once very common throughout the pine forests of the southeastern US. And as Brian described, these forests disappeared over time, and as they disappeared, so did the RCWs. Next slide, please. So RCWs are only found in pine forests. They need pine trees for sleeping and nesting in. Like all our other woodpeckers, RCWs make holes in trees with their beaks, and these holes are called cavities. And there are many different types of woodpeckers in the US, and they all make cavities, but in dead trees, except for RCWs. They only make cavities in living pine trees. So they need pine forests to have their cavity trees. And so the most important thing to save RCWs, of course, is the pine forest. And Brian told us how to restore pine forests to provide wildlife habitat. But some animals need a little more help to be able to find. You can hear me, right, Brian? There we go. Okay.
Yeah.
Okay. So here is how we create ready-made homes for RCWs. The top box is an artificial cavity box. It's just a hollowed out block of wood with an entrance tunnel. And we install the box in a pine tree by placing it inside a hole carved out with a chainsaw. So it mimics a natural cavity that they would make themselves. And they really like these boxes and start using them right away. So with pine forest restoration and management, as Brian described, and by installing these artificial cavities, we have been able to create new RCW habitat throughout the South. But unfortunately, the birds just don't automatically appear. Sometimes they need our help finding these new areas. Next slide, please. So to help the RCW populations expand, biologists from different government agencies and private ones like the Nature call that translocation. So this map shows all the natural areas in the southern United States that are part of the RCW translocation program. The large areas in brown are places that have lots of RCWs, so many that they have enough to share with the green sites. And these green sites are areas that have good pine areas. Some of them have been restored, as Brian described, but they don't have enough birds themselves to find and occupy them. So we bring birds to these sites to help expand the population. Next slide, please. So how do we move the birds? Well, first we have to trap them. And so we use these long nets on poles to sneak up to their cavities at night when the birds have come in to go to sleep in their cavities. And when we approach the tree with the net, the birds get startled and they fly right into the net. And so we put them in these special transport boxes and bring them to new preserves and then climb up trees and put them in their new cavities. Next slide, please. So Brian talked about the importance of monitoring. Monitoring is how we determine whether or not we are accomplishing our goals. As scientists, we have to collect data to show that we are indeed accomplishing what we are setting out to do. And so one goal of RCW translocation is to create new populations where the birds not only survive, but they're successfully creating young. So each year we conduct monitoring to see how the birds are doing. And here are just some pictures of us checking out cavity trees to see if the birds are producing chicks. And we use these special cameras on long poles to see inside the cavities. And at the bottom right is a picture of a new hatchling. Next slide, please. So why should we care about RCWs or any other wildlife? Well, there are many reasons, and one is simply that they make our lives happier. You know, imagine how sad it would be if all the birds disappeared from our backyards, or if we went to parks and didn't see any animals. And people travel all over the world just to see animals because they make us happy. But more importantly, animals play a really important role in nature. And in nature, animals, plants, and microorganisms are constantly interacting with each other. And these interactions are needed to have a healthy earth. healthy enough to provide us with clean air and water and the other things that both humans and animals need to survive. So we really need to all work together to help protect wildlife and natural areas, because if we don't, we could lose them. Thank you.
Hi everyone, I'm Caitlin. I'm the South Florida Marine Conservation Manager for the Nature Conservancy, and I'm based in our Florida Keys office. I'm also one of those rare marine scientists who grew up really far away from the ocean in Ohio. But in second grade, I had a student teacher who taught us about the Great Barrier Reef, and I decided that day that I wanted to be a marine biologist. I don't think my parents thought it would actually happen, but it did, and here I am. And I've actually learned that there's a lot of marine biologists that come from the middle of the country. I think maybe the problem there is the snow. So I wanted to start with some just really basic information about corals, because I often hear that people think that corals are plants because of the way they look and grow. Corals are actually very small animals that are closely related to jellyfish. So the photo in the middle on the top there is what we'd normally call a coral. But in fact, it's a colony of many smaller individual corals called polyps. And many coral colonies living in close proximity is what we know as a coral reef. Corals have tiny algae called zooxanthellae that live inside them, and they produce energy for them. And the really cool thing about corals is that they come in many different shapes, sizes, and colors. And that's what makes a reef so interesting to observe and study. Coral reefs are often called the rainforest of the sea because they're home to so many different organisms. But corals are also really picky about the conditions where they live. They live in relatively clear, warm water, which is why we don't see them growing north of Florida. They become unhealthy when they're exposed to water that's either too hot or too cold, if the water isn't clear enough, if they're touched directly by people or boat anchors or the bottom of boats or really anything. And if they're exposed to certain chemicals and nutrients that can be found in waters near our beaches. Most corals also grow very slowly. So when you see a very large coral colony, it may be a few hundred years old. And this is really important because when a coral colony dies, especially a large one like that, it's not easily replaced. Because corals are so sensitive, we've seen a steady decline in the health of our coral reefs over time. And in some species, we've seen up to 98 to 99% decline. So many really dedicated scientists and managers have been working for years to address some of the issues that are causing this decline. But that alone has not been enough to bring our reefs back to the way they once were. Next slide, please. So as a result, we've developed techniques to help to restore reefs. And the way we do this is that we very carefully collect small fragments from existing coral colonies on the reef, and we bring them into a coral nursery. The coral nursery that I work in is underwater. It's in a sand patch, but there are also nurseries on land where corals are grown in large tanks. The fragments in either place are then attached to structures and left to grow over time with a little help from us. So we do things like removing predators and algae that could harm the corals while they're growing. And then once the corals are large enough in the nursery, we take fragments from those colonies in the nursery and we're able to reattach them to the reef using an underwater epoxy, which is basically like a glue, or a nail and zip tie. The corals then will attach themselves by growing a new base within a few months, and then eventually they'll just grow on the reef like a natural colony would. So within a year, it's actually really hard to tell the corals that we've outplanted from ones that grow naturally on the reef. And like Bea and Brian were saying, we do a lot of monitoring to try to understand how this is impacting the entire reef system. Most of our restoration work to date has been with the faster growing species, like the staghorn coral that I have used as an example here. But there are many of the slower growing species, which we often refer to as the reef builders, because they're the large mounds of corals that you see when you're on the reef that also need to be restored. So scientists are working on ways to promote growth so that they grow more quickly, so that we can more easily recreate the big, old, slow-growing corals that are so important to our reefs. Next slide, please. So people often ask why this is important or why we should care. Coral reefs do so many really important things, and I've highlighted some of those the main things here. Reefs provide habitat for lots of other critters like sea urchins, crabs, and small fish. They protect our homes and beaches from waves by forming essentially a roadblock that causes the waves to break so that only smaller waves get to the shoreline. They provide us with beautiful places to swim, snorkel, and dive. And reefs are really important to many of the fish we like to eat. So grouper, snapper, and lobsters are a few of my favorite. And finally, people ask what they can do to help reefs. You don't have to live near the ocean to make a difference. Pay attention to the chemicals that you use on your lawn, when washing your car, and in the lotions, soaps, and sunscreens you use. All waterways eventually lead to the ocean. Reduce your use of plastic. We often think that plastics only affect sea turtles, but when plastics break down into microplastics, they can actually be eaten by something as small as a coral. If you do get the opportunity to explore a coral reef, and I hope that you all do someday, be careful not to touch the corals with your hands or fins. The corals and those of us working hard to save them appreciate the small changes that everyone can make to help us in our work. And with that, we'll take questions.
Yes, thank you everyone so much. So we're excited to jump into our question portion of today's Q&A. Our first question is going to be for Brian. It is from Rafa, and he asks, how do you control tree logs burning so they don't harm animals or people?
Well, that's an excellent question. And one of the reasons that we like to do prescribed fire under the conditions that we design for them. So it's prescribed, meaning that we have a prescription for the weather, the time of year, the fuels, so that it optimizes, it does the best job that we can have it do. Now, logs definitely do burn, and sometimes the objective of that prescribed burn is to reduce some of those heavy log fuels so that if it gets really dry, like if we get a summer drought and then a lightning strike starts a wildfire, those fuels are already half gone or 3/4 gone or all the way gone, and that helps keep our communities safer. So a lot of the operation behind that prescribed fire is intended to both create ecological effects, meaning that we want to try and stimulate plants to make seeds, and we want to clear off the forest floor like I talked about originally, but also to try and help secure the communities that live within our forested areas so that they're not at risk of wildfire coming and rushing through. And the best way for us to protect those communities is to do little tastes of fire instead of there being one giant, massive, catastrophic fire. So to answer the question, the logs are a big part of it. Sometimes managing those fuels is the objective, and ultimately keeping those communities safe requires us to try and manage those heavy fuels.
So sort of piggybacking off that question, another question came in from Kaylee, and she asks, do other states do control burns just like Florida does?
That's a great question. Yes, states really throughout the Southeast do a lot of prescribed fire, and all the way up into the Midwest. The time of year and the tactics that the operation uses will change a little bit. And then as we move further west in North America, it gets a little bit harder and harder for prescribed fire operations to be approved because it's drier and drier the further west you go. You may have heard about, big catastrophic wildfires in California and Arizona, even up in Alaska. And one of our concerns is as the climate warms, it does get harder and harder for us to find that perfect window that we need in order for the fire to be both safe and effective. And that's something that we're really working on out west, is trying to build a culture around prescribed fire and build the crew of people that we need who have the expertise to do it safely. And that's something that we're still working on.
Our next question is for Caitlin. Caitlin, Jason asks, what is the success rate of coral replantation?
So we generally see about an 80% success rate at a year. One of the really hard things about staghorn coral is that it breaks, and it's supposed to break. That's one of its reproductive strategies. So it gets really hard to define success because the one colony that we outplanted might not be there, but may have just moved on the reef and still be alive. And we want it to do that because it's something it does naturally. So we're still sort of working on how the best way to define success in a situation like that. But it does get really difficult with these corals that break and move, and that, you know, that's a good thing that they do that.
A question came in for you from Harris, and he asks, are you noticing a difference in migratory patterns within birds that we typically see in Florida?
We have on the preserves where I work, we have, and of course it varies from year to year. So it's something you have to look at long term, which is an important reason why we have to do monitoring every year to be able to detect these changes. And so we do see differences. And so, but it varies from site to site.
Okay, jumping back to Brian. Brian, Emma asks, how do trees give us oxygen to help people? And do fires stop this process?
That's a great question. Trees give us oxygen through the way that they breathe. So when we breathe oxygen in and then we exhale out carbon dioxide, that's the way that our bodies are engineered to work. And all plants are the opposite of that. They take in carbon dioxide through their leaves and they expel out oxygen into the atmosphere. So the more forests that we have, the more plant life that we have out there, the more greenery there is around, the more oxygen we're making for our atmosphere. Some people refer to the Amazon rainforest as the lungs of the planet because they're putting out so much oxygen and they're so productive down in those warm, wet areas that they have a really significant effect on how much oxygen there is total all around the planet. And remind me what the second question was?
How do controlled fires burning that area impact that?
Okay, so the plants that we have in our fire adapted forests require fire in order to be able to continue to do the kind of respiratory work that they do. And what I mean by that is if we take fire away, which is something that pretty much all of North America did for the last 100 years, what happens is the plants that grow in that forest shift over to other kinds of trees and grasses and flowers start growing in there that aren't really fire adapted and aren't really as good for this part of the planet at doing those kinds of respiratory work that the fire adapted trees and plants are. So by using fire, we actually help filter out the plants that don't really do such a great job at it and help sort of focus in on the plants. And I'm talking about pine trees and wiregrass and things like that are really good at doing that respiration in these kinds of environments. So real sandy places or real dry, kind of tropical places like Florida is.
Okay, and we have time for just about one more question. And this question is for B. Kathy asks, does the Nature Conservancy ever get involved in relocating birds, such as burrowing owls that are quote unquote in the way of phosphate mining?
No, because the Conservancy, we can't be involved in all of those efforts. And so the reason we chose the red-cockaded woodpecker, because it's the translocation is a very important strategy for the protection of the species, because it's a rare species. And there's a very strong scientific partnership established with all the conservation agencies. They all worked together to develop a plan to make sure that everything was being done in a scientific way so it had the most success. And so we're very selective about the projects like that we get involved in, just simply because we don't have the time and resources. So we have to be selective and do the things that are strategic for us. But other organizations do things like rescue animals and things like that. So there are other people who will do that, because those things are very important too. But the Conservancy itself, that we try to do things that are more strategic at a larger level for rare species. But yes, there are other organizations that are involved with moving more common species like burrowing owls.
Well, thank you all so much. As we start to wrap up, Brian, do you have any final thoughts you would like to leave our attendees with?
Yeah, thanks, Brian. And I want to thank all of our participants that came. I appreciate your attention, and I appreciate the time of my colleagues, Caitlin and Bea, for coming on today. And we all hope that you learned something that helps answer your hypothesis question. And that is, I will be happier, or I will be closer to the answer to the big question that I have in my life if I do blank. Maybe it's attending a workshop, or maybe it's learning a little bit more about coral. I want everyone to take their time and follow your heart, and the rest will fall into place. For the three of us, the Nature Conservancy gives us a place to keep growing into those questions, while at the same time we get to conserve and restore and understand the lands and waters on which all life depends.
Thank you all so much again. At this point, I'm going to turn things over to Stephanie for her closing remarks.
Thank you, Brian. We want to thank everyone for joining us today on the call, and especially to the Nature Conservancy and the great folks that have joined us, Brian, Beatrice, Caitlin, and Rachel. We'd love for you to please take a quick survey at the end of today's call in order for us to better improve the events that we're having. And you can learn more about our guests as well as all of our programs by visiting the websites you see here on your screen. You'll also find a recording of today's event on the UF Thompson Earth Systems YouTube channel. Thanks again for joining us and have a great day. We hope to see you soon. Bye-bye.
Bye.